Good evening, I'm Alma Angeles, and you're watching Eagle News International. On tonight's headlines. The Philippines is welcoming some 398 foreign tourists on the first day of its reopening to fully vaccinated international leisure travelers. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau lambasted truck-led protests that have shut down central Ottawa in anger at COVID-19 health rules as France and New Zealand moved to stop their own copycat convoys. Russia and Belarus launched joint military drills despite concerns in Western countries that Moscow is plotting a major escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. And scientists in Britain announced they had smashed the previous record for generating fusion energy, hailing it as a milestone on the path towards cheap, clean power and a cooler planet. The Philippines has welcomed some 400 foreign tourists today, the first day of its reopening to fully vaccinated international leisure travelers, according to the Department of Tourism, marking the end to the country's nearly two-year closure due to the pandemic restrictions. A large chunk of this number will come from the U.S. and Thailand, with 109 and 93 passengers, respectively. Other countries with more than 10 arriving tourists also include Malaysia, Canada, Japan, United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, and Australia. Let's listen in.
Ating number one tourist dati bago magka-pandemya ay galing sa Korea. Sila yung number one tourist, visa-free country sila. Tinitingnan din natin yung mga neighboring Asian countries. Siyempre, hindi mawawala naman yung ating mga balikbayan na galing sa US na matagal na gustong umuwi dito pero hindi makabuwi dito tayo.
Travelers from visa-free countries are now allowed to enter the Philippines, but they must present proof of vaccination. Negative RT-PCR test results taken within 48 hours prior to departure and outbound tickets to their country of origin or next country of destination. The Philippines recognizes the national COVID vaccination certificates issued by 39 visa-free countries, including Brazil, Israel, South Korea, and Timor-Leste. Based on the latest government guidelines, tourists are also no longer required to undergo facility-based but must still self-monitor for any COVID-19 symptoms for 7 days. With the first date being the date of arrival, travelers will be required to report to the local government unit of destination upon manifestation of symptoms. Meanwhile, members of the Philippine Hotel Owners Association, or FOA, are requesting government for a stimulus program to stem their losses from the removal of quarantine guests. Guest panelists at the Kapihan sa Manila Bay generally welcome the reopening of the country to international tourism, but FOA Executive Director Benita Bengzon Jr. said this.
Many of our hotels are recording single-digit occupancy, and the reason for this is that many of them were really banking on the quarantine guests for their revenue stream. So this has been put to a halt almost completely and has therefore affected the revenue stream. So moving forward, even as we open our borders to international traffic, it is important to provide a lifeline to the hotels which have been suffering. We see that the next 6 to 12 months now will be very difficult. Of course, we look forward to getting confirmation on the onward bookings. This is something that we will have to work on very closely with the tour operators. But what we would like is some kind of financial assistance coming from the government to help us tide us over in the next 6 to 12 months. And perhaps this is something that we can discuss in greater detail with the relevant agencies, particularly with respect to the possibility of a stimulus program for hotels, whether they are members of FOA or otherwise.
Well, we're very grateful to the hotel industry because during the start of the pandemic, I would like to mention the late Christine Ibarreta, because that was
Okay.
March 2020. We could see that everybody was closing. The whole country was, the whole world was closing because of the pandemic. And together with the late Cristina Beretta of the HSMA, we really looked at the possibility of making the hotels quarantine hotels. At the time, I remember, Yusek Bong, not everybody wanted to be quarantine hotel. It was opposite. In ayaw pa eh, they wanted to stay. But then we were always saying, this is naman not mandatory, this is voluntary. And at that time, the late Cristina Beretta was saying that para naman at least make income naman yung hotels. And of course, we are grateful because without the hotels, that's where all the quarantine, those coming, the OFWs, returning Filipinos. Right now, I've been asking kung may nagko-convert. Right now, we have an application of 76 hotels who want to convert to a regular hotel. Already, we have already 76. So from when we announced noong January 28, the total quarantine rooms were about, leisure rooms na lang. The total leisure rooms were about, RD Batin, ilan nga ulit?
It's 15,000. 14,000 po, 14,600.
Oh, right now, we have 15,905 quarantine rooms. So, only 76 applied to a shift from quarantine to regular hotels.
Now, for his part, Tourism Congress of the Philippines President Jose Clemente III said of the tourist destinations in the country, foreign visitors were mostly inquiring about Boracay, Palawan, Cebu, and Bohol, and has allowed the entry of vaccinated foreign tourists from visa-free countries starting February 10 without having to quarantine in hotels. They are also exempt from the 5,000 arrivals quota at the Manila airport. To the U.S. now, New York joined a wave of Democrat-run U.S. states to roll back mask mandates as health officials increasingly talk about America moving towards a phase where COVID-19 doesn't disrupt daily lives. Take a look.
We had a mask or vax requirement for businesses. It was an emergency temporary measure put in place literally 2 months ago. And at this time, we say that it is the right decision to lift this mandate for indoor businesses and let counties, cities, and businesses to make their own decisions on what they want to do with respect to masks or the vaccination requirement. And individuals who want to continue wearing masks, continue wearing masks. And I suspect when I walk the streets of New York City, as I often do, I'm still going to see a lot of people wearing masks because they will feel safer. That is something that they are very, very welcome and encouraged to do. But in terms of having a requirement, it is being lifted as of tomorrow. Education, and I said we have to make sure our schools are open. So after consulting with all these people, part of that whole education ecosystem, we decided that the safest way for the students, the teachers, the administrators, everyone who's part of that system, the safest way for them to return to school was to have a mask requirement. That's what we talked about before I was governor. We instituted my first day in office and said that the era of remote learning is over, except in extraordinary circumstances, and that was the whole genesis behind the mask mandate. So keeping kids safe, keeping them in school.
Now, as we heard there, face coverings in school would remain mandatory until she reviews the situation next month. Their announcements came after several states unveiled plans Monday to lift mask requirements in indoor places and schools as coronavirus infections fall in America. In New York, which has a vaccine mandate for most public indoor settings, including restaurants, gyms, and cultural venues, Broadway said it would continue to require masks inside all theaters until April 30. California's indoor mask mandate for vaccinated residents is set to end on February 15. but vaccinated people will still need to wear masks indoors, according to Governor Gavin Newsom. Oregon is set to lift mask requirements no later than March 31, while Delaware's will expire on Friday, with masks in classroom ending by March 31. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy led the way for the spate of rollbacks, announcing that children and staff would not need to wear masks in schools from March 7. And as we said earlier, New York joined the wave of U.S. states to roll back mask mandates as health officials increasingly talk about America moving towards a phase where COVID doesn't disrupt daily lives. Here are some reactions.
But if it's a restaurant and vaccination cards are being checked, then maybe I feel a little bit more comfortable taking off my mask. But in like places where, like markets where you don't know if someone is vaccinated or not, maybe I'll continue to wear my mask in those kind of settings, you know.
In my job, there's been cases of COVID still going on, so, you know, and you want to feel protected, of course. So with work, I guess it really just depends on the job, but I think, you know, at some point we're going to have to hit that point of taking off our masks. So I think, you know, let's see what happens, you know.
Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau lambasted trucker-led protests that have shut down central Ottawa in anger at COVID-19 health rules as France and New Zealand moved Thursday to stop their own copycat convoys. Earlier, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki also expressed concern about the impact of the protests on the U.S. economy, saying the action poses a risk to supply chains to the auto industry. Let's listen in.
Industries. The reality is the support of the Conservative Party of Canada for people barricading our streets and our border crossings is harming businesses, is harming Canadians who are putting food on the table, is driving up prices, is causing uncertainty, instability, and frustration on top of people who have suffered too much because of this pandemic over the past 2 years. It is time for the Conservative Party to show responsible leadership, to condemn these blockades. You cannot stop a pandemic with blockades. You cannot end a pandemic by decree. You can't end a pandemic by legislation. You need to end a pandemic by relying on science, by public health measures, and by vaccinations. That's exactly what we have focused on through these past 2 years.
Because, as you kind of touched on here, the Ambassador Bridge is Canada's busiest link to the United States and accounts for about 25% of trade between the two countries. And so the blockade poses a risk to supply chains for the auto industry because the bridge is a key conduit for motor vehicles, components and parts, and delays risk disrupting auto production. They've worked with Canadian counterparts to route traffic from Ambassador Bridge to Blue Water Bridge. There's still a lengthy delay, but it is enabling some of these trucks and transports to get through. They also opened all 9 commercial lanes, including a fast lane at the port to process diverted traffic.
Now, the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association President Brian Kingston said the Ambassador Bridge blockade was threatening fragile supply chains already under pressure due to pandemic-related shortages and backlogs. Officials pointed to 5,000 factory workers in Windsor, Ontario, being sent home early Tuesday because of the blockade, and several auto assembly plants preparing to close, as Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens unions expressed fears about the lasting impact on Canadian businesses. Michelle Krebs, a senior analyst with Auto Trader in Detroit, said North American assembly plants rely on timely parts deliveries across the bridge. Meanwhile, a Canadian court on Monday ordered the truckers to stop the incessant honking that has upset residents and made sleep difficult. More on that story from our Eagle News correspondent, Andre Lajoie. Andre.
A judge in the Canadian capital issued a court injunctions Monday to prevent protesters from honking their horns in the downtown area. For more than 11 days, people have had to put up with constant noise of truckers honking their horns 24 hours a day, as well as display fireworks, making life unbearable and making it impossible to sleep. A judge today issued a temporary 10-day injunction saying he wants to hear more evidence. How much effect the injunction will have is not known. A court order is one thing, enforcing is another. After the injunction came down, protest organizer Pat King told truckers not to honk their horns, warning this is the ground police will have to arrest them for disturbing. In another court action, residents are launching a class action to suit seeking nearly $10 million of damage because of the disruptions in their lives that the protesters have caused. Meanwhile, police say they are overwhelmed and need more help. Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson says the Police Services Board Chair Dean Deans have written to both Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Ontario Premier Doug Ford asking them to bolster the city police ranks. They say they need another 1,800 officers and other personnel. And their concerns about the cost of police are estimated. The bill for law enforcement is running as high as $2 million a day. I am Andre Lajoie, Eagle News in Ottawa, Canada.
Thank you, Andre. Meanwhile, Paris police said Thursday they would ban so-called freedom convoys inspired by the truckers' protests against coronavirus restrictions that has paralyzed the Canadian capital, Ottawa. Convoys of vehicles from across France are expected to converge on the French capital on Friday, risking a possible standoff with police similar to the violent Yellow Vest protests that rocked the country back in 2018. A repeat of the Yellow Vests, a nationwide movement against social inequality, would be unwelcome for President Emmanuel Macron as he prepares for April 2022 elections. He remains favored to win. There will be a special deployment to prevent blockages of major roads, issue tickets, and arrest those who infringe on this protest ban, according to Paris Police Force in a statement. The city's ban order will remain in force from Friday to Monday, while police recalled that people blocking roads faced up to 2 years in prison, a fine of 4,500 euros, and a 3-year exclusion from driving. Thousands of people opposed to France's vaccine pass, which restricts access to much of public life to those with a COVID-19 jab, have said on social media that they would rally in Paris. And some plan to continue on to European Union capital Brussels on Monday. Meanwhile, police and anti-vaccine protesters clashed on the grounds of New Zealand's parliament on Thursday, with dozens arrested after demonstrators who have laid siege to the legislature for 3 days were ordered to move on. Let's take a look.
Any person remaining following the grounds being closed will be trespassed and risk being arrested.
The media's not letting the truth.
And I'm
sure she'll say she was scared to come out, but she's got a whole pile of security there to protect her.
Shame on you. This is for the children.
Meanwhile, Japanese authorities are struggling to curb a spike in COVID-19 infections due to the Omicron. The government said it will extend its quasi-emergency measures. Here's the details from Dennis Liu.
The government is considering extending its COVID-19 quasi-emergency designation for Tokyo and 12 other prefectures for about 3 weeks. Officials think that an extension of the designation is needed because of a surge in new COVID-19 cases. In Tokyo, 12,211 new cases were confirmed on Monday, the highest for any Monday in the capital. On Tuesday, the metropolitan government started accepting applications for the kits so that close contacts staying at home can test themselves if they develop symptoms. The kits will be delivered directly to the homes of close contacts. Applications for the kits will be accepted until February 27th. The metropolitan government can accept applications for up to 40,000 kits per day. The spread of the Omicron variant has sharply boosted the number of infected people and close contacts. The health ministry also said the government will provide financial support to help local governments arrange substitute facilities to look after children in their nurseries closed due to coronavirus infections. Given the recent spread of the Omicron variant at nurseries, the ministry has also temporarily recommended that nursery school children wear face masks when possible, but it's not recommended for those under 2 years old. On the medical front, the government will increase subsidies for medical institutes that dispatch nurses to elderly facilities so that residents at such facilities will be able to receive treatment there. It will also strengthen the emergency medical system and facilitate the transfer of COVID-19 patients who were hospitalized but later recovered to local medical institutes without hospital beds specifically allocated to COVID-19 patients. The government will also facilitate giving booster shots to nursery staff as well as those in elderly facilities. New cases exceeded 100,000 a day nationwide for the first time last week, but only 5.9% of Japan's population of 125 million, or about 7.47 million people, have received a third shot since the beginning of December as of Monday, according to the government. This is the latest for now. Reporting from Tokyo, Japan, this is Dennis Liu. We live in interesting times.
Thank you, Dennis. And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba. Sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. May lalabas natin ang aking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa New Era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Welcome back. Russia and Belarus launched joint military drills today despite concerns in Western countries that Moscow is plotting a major escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. The exercises, scheduled to continue until February 20 in Belarus, had begun and would center around suppressing and repelling external aggression, Russia's defense ministry said in a statement. Soldiers would practice beefing up sections of the Belarus border to block the delivery of weapons and ammunition into the country, among other scenarios, according to the statement. And the games have exacerbated deeply strained ties between Russia and the West, which accuses Moscow of massing approximately 100,000 troops around the borders of Ukraine for a potential invasion. Moscow and Minsk have not disclosed how many troops are participating in the drills. But the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed Thursday they had begun. The ministry said in a statement that the objective of the exercises is to practice suppressing and repelling external aggression with a defensive operation, and the drills will also focus on combating terrorism and defending the interests of the Union state, it said, referring to an alliance that binds Russia and Belarus militarily and economically. The Kremlin has insisted the Russian troops will go home after the exercises. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky called the joint military drills launched by Russia and Belarus along his former Soviet republic's border a psychological pressure. As for the risks, he said the risks are there and have been there since 2014. He said in reference to the year Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula and then backed a separatist insurgency in its industrial southeast. Ukraine has launched its own military drills that are due to mirror those being conducted by Belarus and Russia. But military officials in Kiev have said little about them out of an apparent fear of escalating tensions. Now, Zelensky said Ukraine had enough forces to honorably defend his country. Now, while international tensions have soared in recent months over fears Moscow could stage a full-scale invasion, the looming threat of the Russians has been with the Ukrainian forces protecting the frontier a lot longer. Let's take a look.
Так, ми постійно знаходимося в постійній готовності, часто проводимо тренування, злагодження, зокрема бойових резервів, які, так як я зазначав, навчені ведення бойових дій. І так як ми прикордонники, зважаючи на агресію Російської Федерації, ми будемо перші, хто стикнеться із цією ситуацією.
Війна вже 8 років йде, але кожного разу все тривожніше і тривожніше. То якось нам пощастило в 2014-му. Но кожного разу не ж може щастити. Треба бути готовими. Треба сподіватися на краще, але готуватися до не дуже кращого, як то кажуть.
Ця зброя, вона в бойовому стані? Ні. Ця зброя не в бойовому стані, вона не заряджена, тому безпечному стані.
Ну, в связи с той угрозой, которая сейчас наблюдается, я решила подготовиться к этому и быть готовой защитить не только себя, но и окружающих, если это понадобится.
Meanwhile, NATO's chief said Thursday Russia's deployment for a military exercise in Belarus and on the borders of Ukraine marks a dangerous moment for European security. Again, let's listen in.
This is a dangerous moment for European security. The number of Russian forces is going up. The warning time for a possible attack is going down. NATO is not a threat to Russia, but we must be prepared for the worst, while remaining strongly committed to finding a political solution.
Now, both Stoltenberg and Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned Russia that NATO is deploying more forces to its eastern member states, such as Poland and Romania, and that Russia's behavior would not deter them. Stoltenberg said he had written a letter on Thursday to Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, urging Moscow to resume a dialogue under the revived format of the NATO-Russia Council. And there have been several attempts to reach out to Russia's President Vladimir Putin since the start of the Russia buildup, most recently by President Emmanuel Macron of France and Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz. But Russia has continued to increase its presence and battle readiness, conducting exercises in Belarus and the Black Sea, while NATO is still shoring up its eastern flank. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also said that this is a very dangerous moment when he spoke about the Ukraine crisis during a joint press conference with Jens Stoltenberg at NATO in Brussels. Again, let's listen in.
But the stakes are very high, and this is a very dangerous moment. And at stake are the rules that protect every nation, big and small. This is probably the most dangerous moment, I would say, in the course of the next few days, in what is the biggest security crisis that Europe has faced for decades. And we've got to get it right. And I think that the combination of sanctions and military resolve plus diplomacy are what is in order. That it would be an absolute disaster if it were to come to that, and if there were to be serious bloodshed on Ukrainian soil. And I know that people in Russia must be thinking about this too. And I know that in the Kremlin and across Russia, they must be wondering whether it is really sensible to expend the blood of Russian soldiers in a war that I think would be catastrophic.
We go back to pandemic news, where England is aiming to scrap the legal requirement to self-isolate after testing positive for COVID-19 later this month if infection levels remain stable. One of the most dramatic easings of coronavirus curbs taken by any country so far in the pandemic. Here is Ryan Florentino from our UK Bureau. Ryan.
England will scrap the legal requirement to self-isolate after testing positive for COVID-19 later this month if infection levels remain stable. Prime Minister Boris Johnson unexpectedly announced on Wednesday the proposed move would be one of the most dramatic easings of coronavirus rules taken by any country so far in the pandemic. As Johnson doubles down on a strategy of trying to live with COVID, let's see what he has to say.
Provided the current encouraging trends in the data continue, it is my expectation that we will be able to end the last domestic restrictions, including the legal requirement to self-isolate if you test positive, a full month early, Mr. Speaker.
Johnson, questioned with apparent breaches of the COVID rules at Downing Street that have led to calls for him to quit, had earlier said he aimed to end the self-isolation rules on March 24, but addressing lawmakers before Parliament goes into recess on Thursday until February 21. He said he would bring the change forward by a month, to cheers from hordes of his fellow Conservative MPs who have grown increasingly weary with the restrictions. Johnson's spokesman later told reporters it was justified by falling case numbers and hospitalization rates, but noted the law to self-isolate could be reimposed promptly in response to a dangerous new variant. The UK government only has responsibility for health policies in England, with devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland setting their own rules. England lifted almost all coronavirus restrictions in late January that had been reimposed in early December to tackle the Omicron variant, with masks no longer required in enclosed spaces and vaccine passports shelved. That came weeks after the government cut the minimum self-isolation period for those with COVID-19 from 7 to 5 days to help boost economic activity. The government announced 66,000 new infections last Tuesday, as well as 314 new deaths from the virus, taking the country's total toll to nearly 159,000, one of the highest in Europe. Bruce Aylward, Senior Advisor to the World Health Organization, Director General, warned that COVID-19 numbers globally are still absolutely staggering. What we're learning to live with is not just the virus, but we should be an unacceptable burden of disease, an unacceptable number of deaths every single day, he told BBC Radio. Thank you for listening. Reporting from the United Kingdom, I am Ryan Florentino, and we live in interesting times.
Thank you, Ryan. Turning to peace and security, UN counterterrorism chief Vladimir Voronkov told the Security Council that the ISIL terrorist group is on the rise again. He said that the group, known in Arabic as Daesh, continues to move and operate across unprotected borders, while regional affiliates may have gained new capabilities. Again, let's listen in.
Today, Al-Qaeda and Daesh and their various affiliates remain serious threats, while terrorist attacks based on xenophobia, racism, and intolerance are increasing. Starting in Iraq and Syrian Arab Republic, where its operational leadership is still concentrated, Daesh continues to operate as an entrenched rural insurgency, exploiting the porous borders between the countries, where it retains between 6,000 and 10,000 fighters. It's crucial to build on the momentum following the recent death of al-Quraishi. Now is the time to address the grievances that Daesh and other terrorist groups exploit with their propaganda to attract new followers. We must focus on restoring human dignity, trust, and social cohesion. This must start with addressing the desperate situation in displacement camps and detention facilities across Syria and Iraq. Daesh's regional affiliates beyond Syria and Iraq continued to expand at an unsettling scale and pace, partly enabled by the proliferation of conventional arms and weapons, especially in fragile conflict settings.
Over the past 2 years, the terrorist threat has, of course, also intersected with the many challenges posed by COVID-19 pandemic. Daesh and the other terrorist groups have sought to exploit fault lines arising from social restrictions, political tensions, and economic downturns exacerbated by the pandemic.
Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Voronkov said it was crucial for states to remain focused and united to counter the scourge. As people, especially youth, spend more time at home and online, he explained that ISIL propaganda and incitement has continued to grow. He also warned that this could lead to a sudden rash of attacks in some countries when pandemic restrictions ease. To stem the group's resurgence, he underscored the need to disrupt new attacks, tackle the threat of regional affiliates, and solve the protracted issue of their family members in displacement camps and detention facilities across Syria and Iraq. A murmuration of migrating starlings fly across the sky over a power plant outside the city of Beersheba in southern Israel before landing at different locations inside the power plant compound for a good night's rest. Let's take a look. And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be back with the business news. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Mobile Legends!
Pipili ka ngayon ng numero. Yung papakita kay Bandun, malalaman niya yung numero. Alam na alam mo to. Magaling ka sa number eh. Oh.
Paano mo nalaman?
Our first word, freshener. Guys, composed of lots in Muntinlupa.
Sa halaga 1 million pesos. Pera? O jowa. Go!
Hi guys, ako nga pala si Jelry and abangan niyo po ako bilang guest performer sa Letters in Music ngayong February 12, 1 to 2 p.m. Dito lamang sa nag-iisang Net 25. See ya!
Abangan ang mga istorya ng pagbangon sa Season 2 ng Lingap Stories tuwing Linggo, alas 5 ng hapon sa Net 25.
Japan and the Philippines on Thursday signed the 253.3 billion yen or 112.1 billion peso loan agreement for the Metro Manila Subway Project Phase 1. The Japanese Embassy in Manila said the second tranche of official development assistance loan follows Tokyo's first tranche funding of 104.53 billion yen, which was signed in March 2018. The agreement was inked by Finance Secretary Carlos Dominguez III and Japan International Cooperation Agency or JICA Philippines representative Azukisawa Eigo in a ceremony also attended by Japanese Ambassador Koshikawa Kazuhiko. As one of the flagship developments under the Build program, the 17-station subway will reduce the travel time between Quezon City and Ninoy Aquino International Airport from the current 70 minutes to only 35 minutes. It also seeks to address the worsening congestion in Metro Manila caused by poor road network and the rising population's demand for transportation. Meanwhile, monuments across Italy from Rome's Capitoline Hill to the Ponte Vecchio in Florence will go dark today in a symbolic protest by municipal authorities against soaring electricity costs. The ANGI, Association of Italian Communes, estimates bills will rise by at least 550 million euros for local councils, out of a total annual electricity expenditure of 1.6 to 1.8 billion euros. The increase in bills is a burden and puts families and institutions in serious difficulty, with many already struggling due to the coronavirus pandemic, according to Rome Mayor Roberto Gualtieri in a statement. He is switching off the lights of the Capitol Line Rome's Town Hall for an hour from 8 p.m. In Florence, the Palazzo Vecchio, Ponte Vecchio, and Palazzo Medici Riccardi will be turned off for 30 minutes at the same time. Similar action is planned in Milan, Turin, Bologna, Pisa, and others as part of the ANGI organized initiative. Energy prices have soared over the past year, and Italy is heavily dependent on imports to meet its oil and natural gas needs. According to a study by S&P Global Ratings, cited by La Stampa Tampa daily, the rise in electricity will cost at least 35 billion euros extra for the country in 2022. In NBA action, Donovan Mitchell scored 14 points and grabbed 10 rebounds as the Utah Jazz halted Golden State's 9-game NBA winning streak on Wednesday with a 111-85 victory. Bojan Bogdanovic scored 23 points to lead 6 players in double figures for the Jazz, who outscored the Warriors at 48-20 in the paint and out-rebounded them 52-35. Mitchell was playing his third game after missing 8 with concussion symptoms. He handed out 8 assists and said he didn't mind departing late in the fourth quarter to a standing ovation shy of a triple-double. Jordan Poole paced the Warriors with 18 points and Stephen Curry added 16, but Golden State lost by their biggest margin this season. And we'll be back after a short break. Stay tuned.
Araw-araw may bagong kaalaman. Dahil sa Tony Knows, everybody knows! Your Kuya Tony Petgaba na hindi naubusan ng tips. Siyempre, from DIY to life hacks, sagot ko na yan. Saan ka pa? Let's all play together. Let's have fun together. Tara na, sumali at makigulo sa aming kada challenge. Sa kada umaga, kompleto na ang inyong umaga.
Finally, in our news, scientists in Britain announced they had smashed a previous record for generating fusion energy, hailing it as a milestone on the path towards cheap, clean power and a cooler planet. Take a look. Is nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is the same process that the sun uses to generate heat. Proponents believe it could one day help address climate change by providing an abundant, safe, and green source of energy. A team at the Joint European Torus, or JET, facility near Oxford in central England generated 59 megajoules of energy for 5 seconds during an experiment in December, more than doubling a 1997 record. The UK Atomic Energy Authority said, and that is about the power needed to power 35,000 homes for the same period of time, 5 seconds. Let's listen in.
So to give 59 megajoules some context, that's the amount of power that about 35,000 homes would use for the period that we operated. It was only a short period, it was 5 seconds, but that was enough to prove that we could sustain the fusion reaction in a stable way. So yeah, it's about the power that 35,000 homes would use during that time. Exactly right. Tritium and deuterium fuse together to produce helium, which is not radioactive, and a neutron. Now the neutron hits the wall of the vessel, and if you don't choose the materials carefully, you can turn things into radioactive substances in the vessel. But we're going to choose the right materials to make sure that's minimized. So the great thing about fusion is there's no long-lived radioactive waste. The product of the reaction is helium, which is just a gas that actually stays in the plasma and heats the plasma and eventually is pumped away. So that there is no significant waste issue with fusion.
Because you have
where you start from, I mean, ITER is sort of 80% constructed, so once that's operating, if that's successful, as we now think it will be, given the results we've had on JET, we can develop power plant designs in parallel, and yes, we're probably halfway there. I'd say it's very hard to measure, and hopefully, you know, we're always looking for breakthroughs. We want to go faster, and there's so much interest and investment in fusion that maybe we get some breakthroughs along the way that speeds that up, and that's constantly what drives us. We're trying to shorten the time frame as much as we can.
Right. So ITER, in terms of the ITER agreement, has a fixed duration, and so we have to move very quickly to the goal. And so the signature result is important because it qualifies operating scenarios that we would use to meet our main physics objective, which is an energy gain of 10 and 500 megawatts of fusion power. But the general information of all the work leading up to that signature result also is very important to us for informing the ITER research plan. We can't take a lot of false trails. We need to move quickly. And so this information really informs us how, not simply where the good answer might be, but also how to get there effectively.
And the biggest challenge I would suggest the world faces, alongside feeding 9 billion mouths on half the land area with the same energy and water in the next 20 years, is to find sustainable sources of energy. And this technology behind us is a fundamental part, I would suggest, of the global answer to that. And that's why we have identified fusion quite explicitly in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, in our R&D strategy, and in our innovation strategy in BEIS as a technology of tomorrow that we are committed to supporting.
Using the unique combination of capabilities is exactly what our European collaboration of scientists and engineers has done over the last 6 months. Fueling jet with a deuterium-tritium mix and combining all the fusion know-how which we developed over the past decades, we overcame one hurdle after another to produce a sustained fusion plasma that released 59 megajoules of fusion energy in a 5-second pulse.
If all goes well at ITER, a prototype fusion power plant could be ready by 2050. International cooperation on fusion energy has historically been close because, unlike the nuclear fission used in atomic power plants, the technology cannot be weaponized. The France-based mega project also involves China, the EU, India, Japan, South Korea, Russia, and the US. Tim Lucci, head of science and operation at ITER, said the project emerged in the 1980s from talks on nuclear disarmament between US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The promise of endless clean energy is now a step closer after this breakthrough in nuclear fusion technology that could one day help power the Earth. And as always, I'll end the day on a thoughtful note. Our ability to look back and smile at our past is proof that God's plan is to keep us moving forward. And this has been Eagle News International. I'm Alma Angeles. Stay alert and stay informed because we live in interesting times. Good night.